after Donald Trump left the White House, we are still learning new details about his efforts to weaponize the federal government. Still learning more details. This weekend, the New York Times revealed how Trump stunned aides in the Oval Office back in 2018, telling them that, quote, if Attorney General Jeff Sessions would not order the department to go after Hillary Clinton and James Comey, the former FBI director, of course, Mr. Trump would prosecute them himself. Times reporter Michael Schmidt broke it down even further.
The President of the United States said that he wanted to turn himself into a prosecutor. He wanted to use the powers of the federal government to investigate and go after his perceived rivals, enemies, and critics.
So in this piece, Schmidt also says that White House lawyers wrote Trump a long memo explaining that no, he couldn't legally start a prosecution himself. That's not how it works. But they were reportedly so concerned about Trump trying that they smuggled copies of their memo out of the White House so they'd have a record of their efforts to restrain him. And despite concerns by his own White House lawyers, clearly big concerns, his loyalists in the Department of Justice still moved forward. And they did go after people Trump hated, people like Clinton, Comey, John Kerry even, and even former aides who turned against him, like John Bolton and Omarosa. They were all investigated. Trump attacked reporters and members of the media all the time. We all saw this happen publicly. And of course, the Justice Department at the time took it upon themselves to go after the phone and email records of reporters he didn't like. Trump's aides say his pressure to go after enemies was constant and relentless. Former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton told The Times that, quote, when Trump says things like this, he's serious about it. I know from experience that he constantly voiced the idea, and it's something he will come back to until it gets done. But it could have been even worse. I mean, at least some of Trump's worst impulses, some of them were stymied by some officials at the White House and Justice Department. But what if he wins re-election and he had some kind of plan to take out those guardrails? As Times columnist Ezra Klein writes this week, that is what Project 2025 was actually meant to be. It's an effort to build a deep state of Trump's own. Behind the policy playbook sits a database of around 20,000 applicants ready to be part of the next Trump administration. And that database is still growing. The point here is Trump doesn't even need to officially order things to happen. He didn't in all those cases I mentioned. He just needs to put his loyal cronies in positions where they know if he muses about something, it means they should act. And that makes the staffing of the Department of Justice, a historically independent agency that makes their own decisions, even more important. So if Trump does win, what's the Democrats' plan to prevent him from fully weaponizing it? Luckily, I have the perfect person to ask. Congressman Jamie Raskin is standing by, and he joins me next.
It's a plan to upend Democratic government as we know it, and it involves politicizing the federal workforce and gutting the professional civil service, weaponizing the Department of Justice against political rivals and the people.
That's Congressman Jamie Raskin. Of course, you all know him, the ranking Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, talking about Project 2025. The thing is, thanks to this brand new reporting in the New York Times I just talked through, we can see very clearly that there was plenty of weaponizing going on in the first Trump term. Of course there was. But if he wins this November, he now has a blueprint that will let him go much, much further. And Congressman Jamie Raskin joins me now. It's great to see you. I mean, I just went through some of the New York Times reporting. You have a lot of thoughts on this. And one of the things that really stuck out to me in this reporting that I wanted to ask you specifically about is this quote in there. Quote, there is no record of the inquiries and other actions coming about as a result of a formal signed order from Mr. Trump. Instead, he repeatedly signaled what he wanted publicly and privately, leaving no doubt among subordinates. I mean, what's scary about that is that it's just him musing about something. It's not looking for the internal memo. It's people just running with it. And if he staffs the Department of Justice with his loyalists, it could be far worse. But, I mean, what do you make of that? What did you make of that reporting? And what keeps you up at night about all of this?
Well, like all good mob bosses, Donald Trump would make his intentions very clear, both through public statements and private intentions. He might not commit it to a memo, but it was very clear he wanted James Comey, the FBI director, to go after Hillary Clinton and actually to prosecute her. The whole lock her up thing was not just some sort of political whimsy. That was real. And when Comey refused to recommend prosecution going forward to prosecute Hillary Clinton. Then he turned on James Comey and said he should be investigated by the IRS. He should be prosecuted. He would do it himself if he had to, and so on. And, you know, you begin to see that in Donald Trump's paranoid worldview, vengeance really is the substance of politics. That's really what it's all about, going on vendettas against perceived political adversaries and enemies. And it's amazing the people who are on that list, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, of course. Everybody knows about Michael Cohen. He's a private counsel for many years who was willing to do anything for Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump wants to bring the full wrath of the Department of Justice and the federal government down on Michael Cohen to keep him from exercising his First Amendment rights, and saw to it, presumably, that Michael Cohen end up in solitary confinement for a couple of weeks. Now, if he would do this kind of thing to the director of the FBI, the deputy director of the FBI, his own private counsel, imagine what he would do to just any ordinary citizen out there who dares to take a stand against Donald Trump. So when he says dictator day one, everybody's got to take him at his word. He really means that, and he will feel as if he's made his intentions clear, all the more justified. And let's not forget that the United States Supreme Court, in its Roberts Court wisdom, has now said that the President of the United States has immunity from prosecution for actual crimes committed as President of the United States if they are perceived to be within the core functions of the presidency, under the rubric of the core functions, even if they are felony offenses. So he will be totally unbridled.
We don't like to play a lot of Donald Trump clips around here, but to your point, we do have to take him at his word, and it's important for people to hear. And he's at a rally right now in Pennsylvania, and I do want to play you something he said just moments ago, because I think it's important for people to hear it and for people to understand what he means by it.
We're going to go after anybody that gets caught cheating on the election. We're going to go after them harder than anyone's ever been sought before. Because these people are really a threat. They are a threat to democracy. The Democrats are a threat to democracy.
I mean, he said similar things before, but it expands, and he's saying more of it. They are a threat to democracy. What is your reaction? But what should people take from that?
Well, it's a remarkable clip, and I saw three things there. One, of course, it was a projection of his entire approach to this election. He's not campaigning. They're not canvassing and going door to door. They're not trying to enlarge the MAGA coalition. They're trying to figure out ways to nullify votes, as they did on January 6, 2021. They're trying to suppress the vote, repress the vote, control the election. They've got a bag of dirty tricks that are, beginning to be taken out of the bag right now. The second thing is it's a threat. So it's a clear attempt to intimidate people. We saw what they did to election workers in 2020, and they are trying to create as much fear as possible across the country in people who are just administering our elections, the people who make democracy functional in America. But the third thing is, we know based on all the reportage now, that was a promise. He means to follow through on that. He has advertised the names and the faces of those of us who were on the January 6th Select Committee already, saying that we're wanted for various imaginary crimes floating around in his head. But now he's saying that basically everybody who participates in the election will be subject to his vengeance. And he has said he will be an instrument of revenge for his followers. So we've got to take him seriously here.
We got to take him seriously. It's a perfect place to end. Congressman Jamie Raskin, I always love talking to you. I always learn things. I always think